Hello there. This is Dr. Ken with a talk for the speculative fiction class of English Studies about Plato and the dialogue form. Now, this week in the seminar, we'll be reading two excerpts from Plato's dialogues, one dealing with the myth of Atlantis, or actually multiple, a couple dealing with the myth of Atlantis, and one dealing with the story of the Ring of Invisibility, as we may call it, which probably had an influence, almost certainly had an influence on the likes of Tolkien and many since that time. I want to go into a little bit of background and talk about Plato and his context, because I think these are important. So I'll do that first, and then I'll discuss the development of the dramatic dialogue as a genre, as a way of presenting fictional works, because it's during this time, the time of the ancient Greeks, that it develops, that it comes about to begin with, and would influence subsequently everything really in Western writing, especially fiction writing. So we're thinking about Plato, right? His dates are roughly 428 to 348 BC. We go backwards in BC if you weren't sure about that, which puts him at the end of the 5th century and into the middle of the 4th century. So he's Athenian. He's an upper class Athenian, an aristocrat from a very wealthy family. His father had been ambassador to the Persian Empire. His brothers are well connected in politics. He himself did not pursue a political career, but chose to study philosophy and to found what would be the first university in the Western world, known as Plato's Academy. Although he writes much about politics, I dare say, and even puts his brothers into the dialogues as fictionalized characters. What do we know about classical Athens? I'm not sure what sort of background you might have on this topic. Very briefly, I'll just suffice it to say that Greece isn't a nation. Nation states don't exist at this time. It is a bunch of city-states of varying size, and a city-state at this point is defined as a city, which is the capital where the seat of government is, with a hinterland or territory around it, sometimes of sizable nature. So Athens is one of the larger ones and the most wealthy. Sparta is another larger one. There's Corinth, there's Thebes, there are many others, and they are engaged frequently in hostile combat with one another. In fact, during the period of the Athenian Empire, which is sort of mostly the 5th century BC, they were at war with somebody about 3 out of every 4 years. And that would have been normal. Ancient Greece was a very phallocentric, very masculinist, and we would say fairly misogynistic society by modern standards. And I'm not trying to justify this. I don't think there's a justification, but a way of explaining it has to do with the fierce competitiveness between the different city-states, where their very survival often was at stakes. So if a city lost a war, if a city-state lost a war, not only might the fabric of the city itself be utterly destroyed, its entire adult male population could be slaughtered, and the women and children sold into slavery. So those were the odds, those were the stakes, and as a result, the Greeks were sort of hyper-masculinist, geared towards military lines. Plato comes about in Athens during the height of its power as an imperial power. Athens is an empire, it's the head of an empire. Ostensibly, it's a defense league to defend against the Persians. The Persians had invaded earlier in the 5th century, and this was to defend, a bit like NATO, I suppose. But it turns into an Athenian empire with the various allied states being made subjects to Athens. Plato comes about at the time, he's born at the sort of height of empire. During his lifetime, Athens would lose a war with Sparta. They didn't get destroyed, lucky for them. They would actually reform their empire somewhat, but as a reduced second-rate power. And that's that. But Plato is as I say, amongst the richest class of society, in probably the richest city in Greece, and of course the city that we associate with things like the birth of philosophy, art, literature, architecture. For our purposes, it's mainly literature that we want to think about, and Plato, a philosopher is utilizing what we call the dramatic dialogue form. He didn't write essays, he didn't write scholarly treatises putting forward philosophical manifestos, as many philosophers indeed have done. Um, he didn't even give lectures like Aristotle would do. Most of what Aristotle produced were lectures that someone then wrote down. What he wrote were fictional or fictionalized dialogues between individuals based on real people, often based on actual conversations that took place, but not always. In fact, by the time we get to the Republic, which we're looking at, or a section of, it's probably entirely fictional. Some of the earlier dialogues are probably based on actual conversations, but the later ones, and certainly from the middle ones on, are fictionalized or heavily fictionalized. So, why is he doing this? Hard to say. Part of it has to do with a belief of his teacher Socrates that the living word is more important than the written word. The written word is dead. You need people to interact verbally to get to the truth of things. And with a dramatic dialogue, one could have a room full of philosophy students or others sitting around reading out the lines and engaging in a kind of dramatic play. Because it is dramatic dialogue. It's got characters, dramatis personae, much like a real play. So that's one way of explaining it. Another is that his academy had a kind of official or outward-looking learning, what we call exoteric, and then a secretive or hidden learning we could call esoteric. And so the dialogues contain hidden elements of the esoteric learning, but they're packaged for a wider audience. So someone who's had the hidden learning might be able to read one of his dialogues and get something different out of it than you or I might, not having that education. These are all speculations, and we don't know for certain, but what it means is that because Plato has written dramatic dialogues, he's never really telling us what he believes. I mentioned the sort of gendered attitudes of his society. He was, if he believed what he wrote, at any rate, he was out of step with this. So in the Republic and the Laws and elsewhere, he advocates letting women, be in the government, letting them be in the military, educating them alongside of men, which they weren't in Athens. They were in Sparta, but not in Athens. All sorts of things that were very much out of step with the society at his time. And he's aware that these ideas would not be well received. And indeed, they weren't well received until relatively modern times, when people have picked up those arguments again, like John Stuart Mill, basing it on a utilitarian argument of Plato's that not letting women do these things in society is actually wasting half the population. That's perhaps a way of convincing the die-hard skeptics. But Plato seems to believe that male and female minds and souls, or psyche is the Greek word, which means sort of like mind and soul, were identical. There's no real difference between them. Whereas most Greeks saw a major difference. They saw women as lacking self-control, particularly over pleasure, which they were said to have enjoyed 10 times more than men. But there's a lot of hypocrisy in ancient Greek attitudes towards gender. Again, a lot of it comes about as a consequence of their attitudes, the political reality of life in the ancient world of Greek city-states. So where does this come from, right? Somebody had to invent the dialogue form. It didn't just appear magically. In fact, we can trace its origins to a point. There's an earlier philosopher named Zeno of Elea. Elea is in Italy. It's one of multiple Greek city-states in southern Italy before the rise of Rome. There was a school of philosophy at one of these, and this Zeno is the one who comes up with the paradoxes, which are quite interesting and worthy of looking into if you get the chance. He's said to have used the dialogue form in his philosophical writings. None of them survive, or survive only in fragmentary form, so it's hard to look at examples of that. Two historians that precede Plato, Herodotus, who wrote about the Persian Wars earlier in the 5th century, and Thucydides, who writes the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, the wars between Athens and Sparta, both used the dialogue form in their histories to report conversations between individuals historical figures. And these were either, the result of eyewitnesses, or in some cases where the historians themselves had witnessed these conversations. So they're less fictionalized, but still representing a dialogue in a literary context. But this is not the origin of it. Pardon me. The origin of the dramatic dialogue comes about as a result of developments in Athenian stage drama. Pardon me. And these were festivals held in honor of the god Dionysus. So there's a religious dimension, there's a political dimension to them as well. Generals got up on stage and gave speeches during the festival. And the plays themselves often had political overtones, or sometimes jingoistic and populist and patriotic overtones, sometimes criticizing these. At any rate, and we could have had, if I were teaching this class, we could have done a whole class on Greek plays and their use of speculative fiction. But I'm going to talk about it here because all this comes about before Plato, and there's a very observable development as drama develops, and this is quite important for the West because this is where Western drama originates. These are the origins of the dramatic form, comedy and tragedy, and all things in between, even tragicomedy and breaking the fourth wall and meta-narrative. All these things come about in ancient Greek drama. So I'm going to talk about that for a little while now, and then we'll come back and talk about Plato a little bit more in a bit. So for now, I'll talk about the development of drama and in particular the dialogue within drama, which would then influence Plato. How is the worship of Dionysus the origin of tragedy? Well, we don't know for absolutely certain, but it follows from some writings of Aristotle, and the modern scholar Walter Burkert, who's a great expert on Greek religion, has his theory that in ancient times tragedy was explained as a song for the prize of a goat, or a song at the sacrifice of a goat. It has the word, the base in Greek of it, that means goat. Tragoides literally means goat song. And the prize and the sacrifice might not necessarily be two separate things. So it was customary for someone who had won an animal prize in a contest, like a song contest, to sacrifice that animal. So what's not clear is whether the contest was, or whether the origins of drama come out of the song that was the part of the contest, or from the song of lamentation from the sacrifice, or possibly both. And we know that in a song, even after dramas were performed, song contests were still a part of the Dionysiac festival in which tragedies were performed. So choruses sang and danced the dithyramb, it's called, the song of honor to Dionysus, and the winning poet who won was awarded a bull, an animal associated with Dionysus, and then he said he'd sacrifice that bull to the god. Excuse me. In the rural Dionysiac festival, he-goats that had passed their prime were sacrificed. And again, we know that in the rural Dionysia, songs were sung in lamentation to the animal. The person sacrificing it wore a mask, just like an executioner would do. The sacrificers also gave voice to their guilt, as I say in the Song of Lamentation. So these performances could have easily developed into a contest among the competitive Greeks. We know how competitive they were at pretty much everything, and it stands to reason that it would come out this way. As is evident in the stories of the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, and of Iphigenia as well, the myth of Iphigenia, suggests that the sacrificial animal is a kind of stand-in for human beings. So this is a theory, again, that the sacrifice of animals develops as a kind of stand-in for human beings from a time when there was human sacrifice, and that probably would have been the Bronze Age. So Aristotle says, in discussing the origins of tragedy in the Poetics, he doesn't try to explain the connection of tragedy with the goats, but it does sort of explain it, but merely suggests that tragedy arose from an improvisation involving those who led the dithyramb. so the song in honor of Dionysus, or leaders of the dithyrambic chorus. He must be referring to the improvised exchanges between chorus leader and chorus, which developed into dialogue between the actor and the chorus. So, according to Aristotle, a man named Thespis, who must have been a chorus leader, a legendary figure who may have been real, we don't know, stepped out from the chorus and engaged in a kind of like a duet, not really a duet, but an exchange, a musical exchange between himself and the rest of the chorus. And Thespis gives us the word thespian, which refers to actors. There are three great tragedians we refer to. Mainly, again, this comes from Aristotle, but it also comes from the fact that we have their works surviving and can know a bit about them. They seem to have been the most popular, if not always uncontroversial, playwrights. And there's actually a fourth I'll come back to in a minute, but the three famous ones are Aeschylus, Sophocles. So I'll go over a little bit about their background. We know some already about them, but it's worth mentioning a few things about each individual one. Aeschylus is referred to sometimes as the father of tragedy. Born around 525 BC in the city of Eleusa, which is a kind of suburb of Athens, but really a village of its own. And he's immersed in the mystic rites of that place, in the worshipping of the Mother Earth goddess Demeter and the Eleusinian mysteries of Persephone. We're told that he was once sent as a child to watch grapes ripening in the countryside, and according to Aeschylus himself, when he dozed off, Dionysus appeared to him in a dream and ordered him to write tragedies. Obediently, the young Aeschylus began a tragedy that very morning and succeeded easily, we're told. When he first began writing, the theater had only just begun to evolve plays. They were little more than sort of animated oratorios of choral poetry, so kind of like simple operas. That might be a good way to compare them, and maybe not even that, just like a kind of a choral performance with a kind of plot to it, supplemented with expressive dance. The chorus danced and exchanged dialogue with a single actor who portrayed one or more characters primarily by the use of masks, which is a feature that would continue in drama. Most of the action took place in the circular dancing area known as the orchestra, which still remained from the old days when drama had been nothing more than a circular dance around a sacred object. It was a huge leap for drama when Aeschylus introduced the second actor. He also attempted to involve the chorus more directly in the action. So Aeschylus seems to realize that you can have a lot more sophisticated drama if you have two actors exchanging a dialogue, and if the chorus can engage with them, it becomes more realistic. We know that he directed most of his own productions, and according to ancient critics, he's said to have brought the Furies on stage in so realistic a manner that a woman miscarried in the audience. Yeah. But he was also fond of special effects, using colored prisms with fire, or depending on the time, if it was sunny, the sun shining through them to create lighting effects. And we'll recall that he was allegedly accused. Well, he was accused of having introduced, or having put the Eleusinian mysteries, embedded them somehow into his Oresteia trilogy. We talked a bit about that, the light and darkness theme, that sort of thing. If he did that, and it's still debated whether he did or not, he was acquitted eventually. Legend has it that Aeschylus met his death when an eagle mistook his bald head for a rock and dropped a tortoise on it. And eagles drop tortoises on rocks, apparently, to break their shells. Whatever the cause of his death, his life laid the groundwork for the dramatic arts, so that they could flourish. By the time of his death, there were two notable successors ready to take his place, Sophocles and Euripides. He also left behind two sons who would carry on his dramatic legacy. although we only have fragments of their work. The inscription on Aeschylus' gravestone makes no mention, interestingly, of his theatrical renown. It commemorates only his military achievements. So I've got it here. It says his tombstone read, "Beneath this stone lies Aeschylus, son of Euphorion the Athenian, who perished in the wheat-bearing land of Gela. Of his noble prowess the grove of Marathon can speak, and the long-haired Persian knows it well." So he's proud of the fact, or at least his family is proud of the fact that he fought in a marathon, but nothing about his playwriting. We'll see, well, you may not see, but there's a play by Aristophanes called The Frogs, in which Dionysus, interestingly, goes to the underworld to fetch back one of the tragedians after they've died. Initially, he's going to bring back Euripides, but then he changes his mind and brings back Aeschylus, because, and I quote, "Aeschylus taught our men to breathe spears." The sort of inspiration that he gave them was what they needed, it was felt at the time, in those later days. The next one is Sophocles. He is kind of the playwright's playwright. He is the artist's artiste. His dates are about 497 to 406. Born about a mile northwest of Athens, he was to become one of the great playwrights of the Golden Age. Son of a wealthy merchant, he would enjoy the comforts of the thriving Greek Empire. He studied all the arts, and by the age of about 16, he was already known for his beauty and grace, and was chosen to head a choir of boys at the celebration of the victory of Salamis. Recall that from last time. 12 years later, his studies complete, he was ready to compete in the city Dionysia, a festival held every year, as we've seen in the theater of Dionysus, in which new plays were presented. I meant to say the city Dionysia took place in the spring/summertime, when it was much more accessible, and so foreigners attended that one. I think I hear a companion in the barking of a dog. That's Bear having her say. In this first competition, Sophocles took first prize, defeating none other than Aeschylus himself. More than 120 plays were to follow. He would go on to win 18 first prizes and would never fail to take at least second. So he's considered a playwright par excellence. He is the model for Aristotle's theories of how tragedy works. He performed in many of his own plays, which wasn't unusual apparently at the time. We can speculate about Thesmophoria Zouzai by Aristophanes, if Euripides played himself in that or not, but it doesn't seem to have been unusual for the playwright to appear in their own plays. In addition to his theatrical duties, Sophocles served for many years as an ordained priest in the service of two local heroes, Alcon and Asclepius, the god of medicine. He also served on the Board of Generals, a committee that administered civil and military affairs in Athens, and for a time he was director of the treasury, controlling the funds of the associated states known as the Delian League. He was the treasurer of the Delian League. One of the great innovations, his great innovations in theater, he was the first to add the third actor, and abolished the trilogic form. So we think about Aeschylus and the Oresteia, it's 3 plays, a trilogy. Sophocles does away with that. He will write sequels, so there are 3 plays in the Oedipus cycle, but they weren't all performed at the same Dionysian festival. So Aeschylus had used, as we know, 3 tragedies to tell a story. Sophocles chose to make each tragedy a complete entity in itself, packing more action into that space. As a result, you ended up with more action in a shorter form, but it offered greater dramatic possibilities. Many authorities also credit him with the invention of scene painting, and again, using techniques like those pioneered by Aeschylus for lighting effects. When Aeschylus treated the story of Electra, he was concerned primarily with the ethical issues of blood feud. Sophocles dismissed the ethical issues and addressed himself to the problem of character, and he was a consummate developer of characters. And the next one I want to talk about is one we will be reading in some detail. That's Euripides. dates are about 480 to 406. Born somewhere in the vicinity of Athens, he was the son of a man named Mesarchides, destined from the beginning to be a kind of misunderstood poet. He presented his first set of tragedies at the city Dionysia of 455, but didn't win his first victory until 441. In fact, he only won 5 awards, and the 5th of these was not awarded until after his death, and that was for the Bacchae, which we'll be looking at. This lack of recognition might seem a bit odd when one considers that Euripides wrote about 92 plays and was compared even during his own lifetime with the likes of Aeschylus and Sophocles. But Euripides was ignored by the judges at the great Dionysia festival because he didn't cater to the fancies of the Athenian crowd. He didn't approve of superstition and sort of jingoistic nationalism and moral hypocrisy. In fact, he was quite critical of these things, and we don't know if he was an atheist or not. I doubt he was, but he seems to have had varying different views about the gods, though supposedly he might have had some sort of deathbed recantation. At any rate, he was what we might call, well, he was a pacifist against war, a free thinker, and a humanitarian in an age when such qualities were increasingly overshadowed by intolerance and violence. Perhaps that's why he chose to live most of his life with his books in a cave on the island of Salamis. He was exposed early on to religion, we're told, but he would stubbornly question this as an adult. As a child, he'd served as cupbearer to the guild of dancers who performed at the altar of Apollo. The son of an influential family, he was also exposed to the great thinkers of his day, including Anaxagoras, the Ionian philosopher, recall him, who maintained the sun was not a golden chariot being pulled across the sky, but in fact a fiery mass of earth or stone. The radical philosopher had a profound effect on the young poet and left him with a passionate love of truth and a curious, questioning spirit. Always a lover of truth, Euripides forced his characters to confront personal issues, not just questions of state or civic morality. In many ways, he is the forerunner of modern psychological dramatists. So we think of him as an early psychological dramatist, especially exploring the psychologies of women, which again most other writers simply didn't do. I mean, we can think about Clytemnestra in Aeschylus or Asteia, but she's just a kind of villainess, and in that sense there is an exploration of one type of female psychology, but it's a very sort of stereotyped version. In a timeless classic, the Medea, he takes a penetrating look at the frenzied jealousy of a woman who has lost the interest of her middle-aged husband. Perhaps his finest contribution to world drama, however, was the introduction of the common man to the stage. Even his traditional nobles, such as Agamemnon and Menelaus, were anti-heroic, almost as if he wanted to show the Athenian people what their beloved military heroes were really like. So aristocracy gets a kind of, even traditional mythic aristocracy gets a kind of a bad rap, but common people are often portrayed and have significant lines, which is missing from a lot of others. Although many of Euripides' plays dealt with personal issues, he didn't shy away from social issues as well. His Trojan Women was written in response to the Athenian expedition in 416 BC, which destroyed the city of Milos, and we recall that from last time, and slaughtered its men, selling the women and children into slavery. As the play begins, Troy has fallen, its men have been murdered, and its shrines desecrated, and its women bound and enslaved. 10 years earlier, he had written another stinging indictment of war in his Hecuba. He seems to have gotten into trouble for the Trojan women and may have been accused of impiety. He was tried for impiety, in fact, and left Athens in a cloud of controversy. He seems to have been acquitted, although he left Athens at that point. Although he found temporary respite in the court of King Agesilaus in Macedonia, he couldn't escape the fates. In less than 18 months, the tragic playwright was torn to pieces by the king's hounds in a tragic hunting accident. Sophocles appears to have been the only one who died of old age, if we're to believe the story about Aeschylus as well, and was still writing plays. Sophocles was into his 90s, but poor Euripides, torn apart by the king's hounds. The Bacchae appears to have been written in Macedonia, and probably would have been first performed there, but when it was finally performed in Athens, he won posthumously first prize. I put more in the notes about him, if you're interested. The fourth great tragedian, and we might have been reading his works had any of them survived, is a man named Agathon, best known for what Plato says about him in the Symposium. So he's a character in the Symposium of Plato, and it's based upon a real event, an actual dinner party where Alcibiades comes crashing in with some prostitutes under his arms. But what were Agathon's plays like? We don't have any complete ones to compare, but probably the most detailed description of Agathon can be found in Aristophanes' comedy, the Thesmophoria Zouzai, in which Agathon appears as a kind of pale, clean-shaven young man dressed in women's clothes. Regrettably, it's hard to determine how much of Aristophanes' portrayal is in fact, just comic convention. His style, from what we're told, appears to be very high-flung, very refined, very effete, the sort of thing that might appeal more to niche audiences than to the majority, although he was a celebrated playwright and regularly won first prize. Pardon me, which I think is what the Symposium, the dinner party that Plato writes about, is actually celebrating, because he's won first prize. He seems to have been close friends with Aristophanes and others like Alcibiades and Socrates as well. Personally, we know that he had a male lover named Pausanias, and that they lived together as if they were married. And he was a friend of Euripides too. He would go to the court of King Agesilaus in Macedon with Euripides and bring along his partner Pausanias as well. We don't know a lot more about Agathon, though, unfortunately. If you want to learn more about him, you can read Plato's Symposium, if you like, and see his speech in there, which may be based in some sense on something he actually said. You can see how these things developed. The history of the development of drama and the dialogue form is integral to tragedy and comedy in Athens in the 5th century BC. A lot of this happened before Plato was born. By the time he's around, it's more or less fully developed, and so he would have grown up going to the theater, seeing these plays performed, seeing these fictional dialogues between individuals on stage. And as I say, he's not the only one. The likes of Herodotus and Thucydides are also writing in dialogue form, albeit in a different, in history writing. But Zeno as well, of Elea, who's just a bit before Plato's time, would have been exposed to these things as well. So this is probably the origin of the use of the dialogue form, the idea that you can have fictionalized representations of individuals engaging in a dramatic conversation. And if you're interested in drama, I suggest looking at Aristotle's Poetics. It's largely a descriptive treatise talking about how it's mainly based on Sophocles' plays. He was considered one of the greatest playwrights of his era. So it's really descriptive, but it's often been taken as prescriptive. Still, it's a useful writing on, and it's one of the first examples really of literary criticism, although we get some in Plato as well, and some from the playwright Aristophanes. But this is the birth of these things. This is the birth of literary studies. So Plato is using the dialogue form, and it gives him a great deal of freedom to express his views, whatever those may be, and to present certain philosophical ideas for people to consider. And so, as we're reading these stories, I think we need to think about, and we will discuss in class, what are the moral implications of them? What is the message that they're trying to get across? Is there a message? Is it clear what that message is? If, again, one who studies Plato will read lots and lots of these things, will pick up on trends and ideas. And what Plato likes to do, it seems, is to illustrate his ideas by examples. So in the case of the myth of the ancestor of Gyges and the ring of invisibility, Where is he getting this example from? The short answer is we don't know. Some of this is alluded to in the history of Herodotus, because he talks about the history of the Persian Empire, of which Gyges is or the ancestor of Gyges is connected, to which he's connected. So a little bit of it there, but not really the story of the Ring of Invisibility. Now, as I say, Plato's father had been an ambassador to Persia, and this will have meant that again, Plato was exposed to a lot of ideas and thoughts that many people of his own, even his own class, wouldn't have necessarily been because of his unique circumstances. Possibly the tale originates with his father. Possibly when his father was back at home and foreigners were coming in to visit him, Persians or others from the East, maybe they brought the story with them. We don't know. He probably didn't make it up, but he's using it as an apt example of illustrating a kind of moral as to how one ought to behave. And I'll say no more about that for now, except that it's interesting. The story itself is very interesting and clearly has an inspiration on a range of things. We know Tolkien, for example, studied the classics. He switched to medieval studies, but he studied the classics. He was very familiar with Plato, so he will have encountered that story long before writing his Lord of the Rings or Hobbit series. What about the myth of Atlantis? Well, again, there is no other source that we can find apart from Plato, no earlier source apart from Plato on this. One theory is that he just made it up. I don't think he did. I suspect it is, as he says, that the story comes from his forebear Solon the Lawgiver. Solon was alive, as I say, at the end of the 6th century. He's related to Plato on his mother's side. And Solon was an aristocrat who was given charge of reforming the constitution of Athens. He would institute a number of democratic reforms at that point, but then left the city for 10 years to let them sort of settle in. He was afraid that he would be treated as a tyrant. There are other reasons as well why Solon might have gone away for 10 years. He seems to have canceled all the debts, but prior to canceling them, took out a number of loans and bought some property with them. So maybe he had some reasons for leaving. Anyway, he traveled around. He traveled to the east, to Lydia, which was a kingdom in Asia, where a king named Croesus lived. And he traveled, we're told, to Egypt as well. And according to Plato, the story of Atlantis came to Solon from some priests in Egypt that he spoke to, and then was passed down in the family. That is perfectly plausible. It connects with what we know of him and his family and Solon, but as I say, there is no earlier source for it than Plato. So if it is, based, and a lot of the other examples that Plato will use in his philosophy come from mythology. So there would be stories that either people had heard of, or would have had some origin back then that we no longer possess. This is a problem with ancient sources. We know that of what survives from classical antiquity, we only have about 1%. Compared to what was actually written. So there are a lot of treatises, a lot of books, essays, articles, whatever, written at the time that just don't exist anymore. So there probably were earlier sources on this that aren't around. At any rate, Plato is going to use it to get across a moral, a message. And so that's for us to think about. And I want us in the seminar then to go through the stories and think about them, think about how they're written, as a kind of frame narrative, right? So a narrative within a narrative. You've got the dialogue form itself, which is a major development in literature. And then you've got, within that dialogue form, a character telling a story. And this is, I think, quite interesting and a tried and true technique. Again, the Greeks seem to invent it, but you get other writers, Boccaccio, Dante, and then Chaucer in our own country in the 14th century, using the frame narrative where you've got a tale within a tale, and sometimes a tale within a tale within a tale. It's a very effective way to frame a narrative. So if there are any creative writers amongst you, you might consider using this method. It works really well. we'll think about the technique, but we'll also, and then what happens in the story and what it's about, but we'll also think about, morally speaking, what kind of message Plato is trying to get across. And I can tell you, and I'll conclude more or less on this now. Um, Platonic philosophy contains a lot of things. It contains metaphysics that describe how the universe works, the theory of forms, famously, the immortality of the soul, the reincarnation. It also contains a lot of moral philosophy. And Plato's moral philosophy could be summarized essentially as basically be nice to one another and be moderate in your life. It's always about moderation. Plato regards extremes of any kind as being, as leading to grief. Very briefly, I'll describe his arrangement of the psyche, right? The soul. We translate psyche as soul. It really means something more like mind, but also spirit. At any rate, he says a soul has three parts, or his characters say this. We don't know what Plato thought. The three parts are the reasoning part, the part that loves honor, we might call it the competitive part, and the part that has the appetites, the appetitive part. In a person who is, he calls this person a tyrant, in the tyrannical soul, the appetites are in charge. So reason and the competitive part are subordinated to the appetites. The tyrant is someone who is constantly trying to get more than everyone else. And no matter how much they get, they're never satisfied with it. It's always about getting more, always one-upping everyone else, but then never being happy with it. He compares this to trying to fill a cup that has holes in the bottom. You'll never be able to do it. So that's the state to avoid. What is the good state? What is the right, the proper way to be morally? He defines this along the lines of well, again, this tripartite psyche, whereby the reasoning part is in charge and the appetites and the competitive parts are subordinated to reason. So reason always checks these other things and prevents them from getting out of hand and pursues a path of moderation. Moderation is one of the greatest virtues. And his argument, based on a purely utilitarian position, if you ignore the metaphysics, which some people will choose to believe and some not, there's a lot of metaphysics behind it, but if you ignore the metaphysics, in his argument, the just person, the person who has reason ruling them, is going to lead a happy life. They're not going to suffer from a lot of illnesses because they're not going to extremes in food and drink, or excessive lifestyles. They're going to have friends because people can trust them and people like them because they're nice. Whereas the tyrant, though he may become, or she may become, quite wealthy and powerful, they're never going to be happy because they can never get enough to satisfy them, and they're always going to make enemies. So they will be hated and reviled their lives through. They'll go to sleep at night fearful that someone's going to kill them, so they'll sleep with a weapon under their pillow, and generally lead pretty miserable lives. They may suffer health problems because of going to excess in various things, foods and drink and so forth. So based on that argument alone, it's not a bad morality, but this figures prominently into everything that he teaches. This notion of moderation and reason's rule, and this the appetites being subordinated. So we'll see if we can pick up on these themes in the tale of Atlantis and the myth of Gyges' ancestor, that is the ring of invisibility. So I think I shall leave it there for now. I'll happily answer other questions about the ancient Greek context with which you might not be so familiar in class when we come to it. And I thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye for now.